Chapter 1, The House at the Edge of the Woods. When Artyom first saw the house, he knew right away. Something wasn't right about it. Not in a bad way. Not in an obvious way. The house wasn't falling apart. It didn't look abandoned. The paint on the walls was faded, but the windows were intact, the roof straight. Even the garden around the house looked like someone had once cared for it. But still, the house seemed to be watching him. Artyom stood by his car, holding the keys he'd just gotten from the realtor. Strange place, the man had said before leaving. But the price is good. Very good, and that was true. Too good. The house cost 3 times less than any other house in this area. Artyom had asked several times, why so cheap? The realtor had just shrugged. The owners want to sell fast. Why? The realtor looked at the house, then back at Artyom, and answered very briefly, they just don't want to live here anymore. After that, he quickly got in his car and drove away. Now Artyom stood alone. Before him, an old 2-story house, and behind the house, the forest began. Not small, not sparse, a thick, dark forest that stretched to the horizon. Artyom took a deep breath. All right, he said quietly. New house. He walked to the door and inserted the key in the lock. The lock turned easily, too easily, as if it had been opened often. The door creaked slowly, and the house breathed for the first time. The smell inside was strange. Not dusty, not rotten, rather old, the way houses smell when no one has lived in them for a long time, but where the memory of people still remains. Artyom entered. The floorboards creaked quietly under his steps. Inside it was dark. Light from the windows barely illuminated the hallway. He set his bag on the floor and looked around. Left kitchen, right living room. Straight ahead, stairs to the second floor. Nothing unusual, nothing scary, but still Artyom suddenly felt a strange sensation, as if he wasn't alone. He quickly turned around. No one. Great, he muttered, already starting to imagine things. He went to the kitchen. Empty cabinets, old table, dusty window, nothing special. Then the living room, also empty, but there he noticed something strange. A nail hung on the wall. Just one, and around it was a light mark, as if a picture or photograph had hung there for a long time. But it had been removed. Very recently. Artyom frowned. He ran his hand over the mark on the wall. There was almost no dust there. Strange, he decided not to think about it. Instead, he went up to the second floor. The stairs creaked louder. Step, creak, step, creak. The second floor turned out to be just as empty. 3 rooms and a bathroom. He checked each one. Empty, absolutely empty. When he was about to go back downstairs, he suddenly noticed a door at the end of the hallway. Small, almost invisible. He approached it. The door was closed, but not locked. He carefully opened it. It turned out to be a small storage closet. Empty, except for one thing. On the floor lay an old photograph. Artyom picked it up. Black and white. It showed a house. This house, he recognized it immediately, but something in the photograph was strange. He looked closer. On the porch stood a person. A man. The face was somewhat blurred, but the longer Artyom looked, the more an unpleasant feeling overcame him, because the man in the photograph looked very much like himself. Nonsense, he whispered. He turned the photograph over, and then his heart skipped a beat. On the back was written by hand, "Welcome home, Artyom." He slowly raised his head. The house was absolutely silent, but suddenly, from above, right over his head, a sound, a creak, as if someone had taken a step. Artyom froze. He was standing on the second floor, and above him there was nothing, except the attic, and someone was walking around up there. Chapter 2, Footsteps above Artyom stood motionless. The photograph was still in his hand, and the sound came again. A creak, somewhere directly above him. He slowly lifted his head and looked at the ceiling. There was a small square cover, an attic hatch. Probably wood, he said quietly to himself. Old houses always make sounds. Floorboards expand, beams shift, wind moves across the roof. It's normal. He took a step back, and at that moment, he heard the sound again. But now it wasn't just a creak. It was a footstep. Heavy, slow, as if someone had walked across the attic. Artyom felt cold run down his spine. He looked at the hatch again. Silence. Great, he exhaled. First night in the new house, and I'm already going crazy. He shoved the photograph in his pocket and went downstairs. While he unpacked, everything was quiet. The sun gradually sank behind the forest. The house filled with long shadows. By evening, it was almost dark inside. Artyom turned on the lights. The lamps glowed dimly, but it was enough. He put the kettle on in the kitchen and sat at the table. Silence, too quiet, In the city, there's always sound. Cars, people, wind between buildings. Here, nothing. Only the forest. Sometimes the sound of wind through the trees carried from far away. And that was all. When the kettle boiled, Artyom poured himself tea. He was almost calm now. The sound probably really was just an old beam. He took a sip, and then, a creak. The cup stopped at his lips. The sound was from above again, this time completely distinct. A footstep, and then another. Artyom slowly set the cup on the table. He listened. Silence. Almost a minute passed. He was starting to think he'd imagined it. And then the footsteps started again. Now there were more of them. Creak, creak, creak. Someone was walking in the attic. Not quickly, not randomly, as if studying the house. Artyom stood up. "Hey," he said loudly. The footsteps stopped. Instantly, as if whoever was upstairs had heard him too. The house fell silent again. "Great," Artyom muttered. He took a flashlight from his bag. His heart was beating faster. There was only one logical explanation. An animal. A cat. A raccoon. Maybe a bird. The attic could be open. He went up to the second floor. Every step creaked. The hallway was darker than before. The window let in only weak evening light. Artyom approached the hatch. He stopped. There were no more footsteps. "Of course," he said quietly. "As soon as I decided to check." He put a chair under the hatch, climbed up, and pulled on the ring. The cover slowly opened. A stream of cold air fell down on him. Artyom turned on the flashlight and shone it up. The beam of light cut through the darkness. Dust swirled in the air. Old beams. Nothing else. He sighed. "I thought so." He was about to close the hatch, but suddenly the flashlight caught something on the attic floor. A mark. Artyom frowned. He climbed higher and lit up the spot. It was a print. In the dust. A footprint. Human. Not old. Completely fresh. And nearby, a second one. And a third. As if someone had walked there just minutes ago. Artyom slowly climbed down from the chair. He stared at the hatch. It was dark inside. And suddenly, a sound came from the darkness of the attic. Quiet. Almost a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind. But then the words became clearer. Someone was whispering. Very quietly. Very slowly. And that voice spoke just one word. His name. Artyom. The flashlight fell from his hand. The beam of light rolled across the floor. And in that brief moment, when the light accidentally illuminated the ceiling, Artyom saw a shadow. It was moving, right above the hatch, as if someone was standing in the attic. And looking down. Chapter 3, Room Without Windows. Artyom didn't remember how he ended up downstairs. 1 second he was standing under the hatch, staring at the moving shadow in the attic. And the next, he was already sitting in the kitchen, clutching a mug of cold tea. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if nothing had happened, as if there had never been any footsteps, as if the voice that whispered his name was just his imagination playing tricks. Artyom looked at the clock. 9:47 p.m. "Great," he said quietly. "First day and I'm already talking to myself." He tried to think logically. Old house, forest nearby. Maybe someone had climbed into the attic. Could be a homeless person, or teenagers, or maybe one of the previous owners left a way in. Yeah, that sounded reasonable, but the thought that someone might be in the house right now wouldn't leave him alone. He stood up. "All right," he said to himself. "Let's check everything one more time." He grabbed a flashlight, went up the stairs. The second floor was colder than before. The hallway stretched like a long, dark strip. Moonlight from the window illuminated only part of it. The rest was swallowed by shadow. Artyom took a few steps, and suddenly stopped. Something was wrong. He slowly looked around the hallway. Room on the left, room on the right, bathroom, and he frowned. At the end of the hallway, there was now a door. It hadn't been there before. Artyom was sure. He'd checked this floor during the day. There had just been a wall. But now, there stood an old wooden door, with a darkened handle. "No," he whispered. He took a step back. No, no, no. Maybe he just hadn't noticed it earlier. Yeah, possibly. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. Doors don't just appear in houses by themselves. He moved closer. The door looked old, much older than the others in the house. There were scratches on it, deep ones, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Artyom reached out his hand. His fingers were trembling. He touched the handle. It was cold, ice cold. He slowly turned it. The door opened without a creak. Behind it was darkness, absolute. He turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and Artyom stepped inside. The room was small, square, and completely empty, except for the walls, and on the walls hung photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They covered the walls almost completely. Artyom slowly moved closer. All the photographs were black and white. In each one, a person. Men, women, sometimes children. Some looked old-fashioned, as if the pictures had been taken decades ago. Others more modern, but they all had one thing in common. They were standing in front of this house, just like Artyom had stood in front of it today. He swept the flashlight beam across the wall. The photographs went in rows, one after another, one after another, one after another, as if it was a collection. And suddenly he noticed something strange. In all the photographs, people were smiling, but their eyes looked like they knew something terrible. Artyom felt anxiety growing inside him. He walked over to the last wall and stopped. There was an empty frame, a big one. It hung right in the center of the wall. There was no photograph inside, only a white sheet, and on the sheet was written in marker, Artyom, his name, in large letters. He froze. His heart started beating faster. "This isn't funny," he whispered, and at that moment the door behind him slowly closed. Quietly, almost silently, click, Artyom spun around. He ran to the door, yanked the handle. It wouldn't move. "Hey," he shouted. No answer. He pounded on the door. "Open up," silence. But then, behind him came a sound. Very quiet. He slowly turned around and saw that the photographs on the walls had changed. They no longer showed empty houses. Now in each photograph, the people weren't standing alone. Behind them, in the shadow of the house, stood figures, dark ones, blurred, inhuman. And when Artyom looked at the empty frame with his name, he realized it was no longer empty. A photograph had appeared inside. Fresh, it showed him, standing in front of the house, just like during the day. But behind him, someone was standing, very close, so close they were almost touching his shoulder. And Artyom understood the most terrifying thing. When this photograph was taken, he had been alone. Chapter 4, Voices in the walls. Artyom stood before the photograph and couldn't move. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand. In the picture was him, definitely him. The same clothes, the same car in the background, the same moment when he first approached the house. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was the shadow behind his back. The figure stood too close, so close that its hand almost rested on his shoulder. But Artyom clearly remembered that moment. He had been completely alone. He spun around to the door and yanked the handle again. Locked. He slammed his shoulder against it. The door didn't even budge. "Damn," he whispered. The room suddenly seemed smaller. The walls appeared to have moved closer. The photographs around him seemed to be watching. He lit them up with the flashlight again. Now he could see more details. Some people in the pictures looked frightened. Some looked exhausted. Some looked like they knew they were being photographed for the last time. And behind each one of them, there was always a shadow, a figure, someone who stood behind them. Artyom slowly took a step back, and then he heard a sound, very quiet at first, so quiet he thought it was the wind. But there couldn't be wind in the room. The room had no windows. The sound came from the walls. He listened carefully. It was whispering, several voices, very quiet. At first, the words were impossible to make out, but gradually they became clearer. The voices spoke simultaneously. Male voices, female voices, old ones, young ones, and they were all whispering to each other. Artyom slowly turned toward the wall. The whispers came directly from it, as if someone was inside the walls. He moved closer and pressed his ear to the cold surface, and then he heard the words, "Don't go out." Another voice, "He's here too." Another one, "We tried." The voices interrupted each other. Sometimes they sounded very close, sometimes like they were deep inside the wall. Artyom recoiled. "Who are you?" he shouted. The voices fell silent. The room was plunged into silence again. 1 second passed, 2, 3, and suddenly from the wall next to his shoulder came a voice. Very clear, very close. "Female, we lived here." Artyom slowly turned his head. "Who?" The answer came immediately. "Everyone." In the photographs, the flashlight trembled in his hand again. "What happened to you?" Several seconds of silence, and then dozens of voices whispered simultaneously, "The house." The words stretched out in an echo. "The house took us." Artyom felt cold grip his chest. "What do you mean? Took you?" And then the walls began to speak. The voices grew louder, closer. Now he could hear them so clearly, as if people were standing right next to him. "He chooses. First you hear footsteps. Then you find the room. Then he shows you the photographs. Artyom felt everything inside him clench. And then what? The answer came almost immediately, but only one voice said it. Deep, male, old. Then you understand. A pause. Long, heavy. Artyom could barely breathe. And then the voice finished. That you'll never leave again. At that moment something struck the wall from inside. Dully, hard, bam. Artyom cried out and jumped back. The wall struck again. Bam, and again, as if someone was trying to break out. The photographs on the walls began to sway slightly. Whispers filled the room again. Now the voices sounded frightened. Panicked. He's coming, he heard. Too late, Artyom screamed, who's coming, but no answer followed. Because at that moment behind him, the door slowly opened. He turned around. The hallway was empty, but the darkness there seemed deeper than before. The voices in the walls now whispered only one thing. Over and over, over and over. He's coming, he's coming, he's coming. Artyom took a step back and suddenly realized one terrible thing. The whispers no longer came from the walls. Now they were coming from directly behind his back. Chapter 5. The man in the attic. Artyom spun around sharply. The flashlight in his hand was shaking so violently that the beam of light darted across the walls of the room. But there was no one behind him. Only the hallway. Empty. Dark. The voices in the walls suddenly fell silent, as if they had never been there at all. Artyom stood motionless for several more seconds. He listened. Not a sound. Even the forest outside seemed to have stopped existing. The silence was so deep it rang in his ears. He slowly stepped out of the room. When he found himself in the hallway, he turned around. The door behind him was open, but now the room looked different. The photographs still hung on the walls, but the empty frame with his name was no longer there. Artyom blinked. He stepped back into the room, illuminated the walls. Photographs, 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 but the frame had vanished. No, he said quietly. He was certain he had seen it. He had stood right in front of it. He had even seen his photograph. But now nothing, as if the house had changed its mind about showing it to him. Artyom quickly left the room, and at that moment, a sound came from above again. A creak. He froze. The sound was familiar. A footstep. In the attic. But now it sounded heavier, slower, as if someone was moving very carefully across the beams. Artyom looked up at the ceiling. His heart sped up again. Great, he whispered. Again step. Pause. Step. He remembered the tracks in the dust in the attic. Human, not animals. And suddenly a thought came to him. If this is a person, that means he should check. Maybe this very person is doing all of this. The photographs, the whispers, the strange things in the house. Artyom went upstairs to the second floor. Now the footsteps above could be heard even more clearly. Creak, creak, creak. Someone really was walking around in the attic. He placed the chair under the hatch. For a second, he just stood there, listening. The footsteps stopped, just like last time. I know you're there, Artyom shouted. Silence. He turned on the flashlight, climbed onto the chair, and yanked open the hatch. Cold air hit him in the face again. Dust rose into the air. The flashlight beam illuminated the beams. Old boxes, pieces of boards, and a person. Artyom cried out and nearly fell off the chair. In the depths of the attic sat a man. Thin, very thin. His clothes were dirty and torn. His hair long, tangled. He sat pressed against a beam, looking at Artyom. His eyes were huge, frightened, but alive, very much alive. For several seconds they just stared at each other. The man spoke first. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Are you new? Artyom swallowed. What are you doing here? The man slowly stood up. He moved carefully, as if every movement was difficult for him. I live here. The answer sounded calm, as if it were perfectly normal. Artyom couldn't believe it. In the attic, the man nodded slightly. Yes, how long? The man looked away as if trying to remember. A long pause passed, and then he said quietly, 20 years. Artyom froze. That's impossible. The man looked at him again. There was something strange in his eyes. Something between exhaustion and fear. You said that at first too. What? The man took several slow steps closer. Now the flashlight illuminated his face, and Artyom saw that it was covered with thin scratches, as if he often tried to crawl through narrow spaces. I also thought I'd leave in a couple of days, the man said. Why didn't you leave? The man looked at the hatch, then at the dark forest through the small attic window, and quietly answered, because the house doesn't let you go. Cold ran down Artyom's spine. That's insane. The man smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. Have you heard the voices yet? Artyom said nothing. The man nodded. So you have. He took another step closer. Have you seen the room with the photographs? Artyom's heart skipped a beat. Yes, the man nodded again. Then it's too late. Too late for what? The man looked directly into his eyes and whispered to get out. At that moment, the entire house creaked loudly, as if something enormous had shifted inside the walls. Dust fell from the beams, and then from the depths of the house came a sound. Muffled, slow, a footstep. But this wasn't an ordinary footstep. It was too heavy, as if someone enormous was walking across the floor. The man in the attic went pale. He grabbed Artyom's arm. His fingers were ice cold. Quiet, he whispered. Artyom could barely breathe. The footsteps sounded again. Closer now. Boom, the house trembled slightly. The man looked at the hatch. His eyes widened, and he whispered words that made everything inside Artyom go cold. He's awake. Chapter 6, The Forest That Watches Artyom and the Man in the Attic froze. A heavy footstep echoed through the house again. Thud, the floorboards somewhere below creaked, as if someone very heavy had walked across them. Artyom slowly looked at the man, who woke up. The man pressed a finger to his lips. Quiet, another step. Now closer to the stairs. Thud, the house seemed to answer with a quiet groan of old beams. The man leaned over the trapdoor and carefully lowered the cover, sealing off the attic. They were left in complete darkness. Only the weak beam of the flashlight illuminated the dusty air. Turn off the light, the man whispered. Artyom hesitated for a moment. Turn it off, he clicked the button. The attic plunged into darkness. Now they could only hear the sounds of the house. And footsteps. Thud, thud, they moved slowly across the first floor, as if someone was searching. Artyom felt his heart beating in his chest, so loudly it seemed it could be heard. He leaned toward the man and whispered, "Is it human?" The man shook his head. Very slowly. No, the footsteps stopped. Right beneath them, the floorboards quietly groaned. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then a sound came. From below, from the stairs. Creak. One step. Pause. Creak. A second. Someone was climbing to the second floor. Artyom clenched his fists. The man beside him barely breathed. The footsteps stopped. Now they were directly under the trapdoor. The silence lasted almost a minute. Artyom felt cold sweat running down his back. And suddenly, a sound came from under the trapdoor. Quiet, slow, scraping, as if someone had dragged something across wood. The trapdoor trembled slightly. The man suddenly grabbed Artyom's arm. "Don't move," the scraping repeated. Stronger now. The trapdoor shuddered again. Artyom stared into the darkness, feeling panic rising inside him. But then the sound suddenly stopped. Footsteps echoed on the stairs again, this time going down. Creak, creak, creak. Someone descended to the first floor. Then the footsteps moved away, and the house plunged into silence again. Several long minutes passed. The man finally exhaled. "It's gone." Artyom turned on the flashlight. What was that? The man slowly sat on the floor. He looked as if he had just survived something terrible. "The house," he said quietly. "What do you mean the house?" The man looked at him with tired eyes. "I told you the house is alive." Artyom shook his head. "No, no, that's impossible." "I thought so too." He pointed to the small attic window. "Come on." They carefully approached the window. The man slightly pulled back the dirty curtain. "Look," Artyom peered outside. The night was dark. The forest around the house stood motionless. But a second later, he understood what the man wanted to show him. Someone was standing among the trees. At first, Artyom thought they were just shadows. But then his eyes adjusted to the darkness. And he saw them. Figures. Many. Dozens. They stood among the trees, motionless, as if watching the house. "Who are they?" Artyom whispered. The man answered immediately. "Those who tried to leave." Artyom felt cold gripping his chest. "Are they alive?" The man was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "They were." Artyom looked into the forest again. The figures didn't move. They just stood and watched the house. But suddenly, one of them slowly turned its head, straight toward the attic window, toward Artyom. He jerked back sharply. "They can see us." The man nodded. Always, Artyom peered outside again, and in that moment realized one terrible thing. There were more figures now. Now they stood closer to the house, much closer, and one of them began walking toward the porch. Chapter 7. The old diary, the figure in the woods, moved slowly toward the house. Artyom watched from the attic window, unable to look away. It walked very slowly, almost unnaturally. Step, pause, step. The other figures remained between the trees, motionless, as if waiting. "It's coming here," Artyom whispered. The man in the attic didn't even look out the window. He already knew. "They sometimes come closer," he said quietly. Why, the man shrugged, probably trying to remember what it's like, being inside. Artyom felt everything go cold inside him. You said they tried to leave? Yes. And what happened to them? The man finally looked out the window. The figure was already standing by the porch. It froze at the door, didn't move. They became part of the place, he said quietly. That's not an answer. It's the only answer. Artyom looked at the figure again. It stood too still, too quiet, as if waiting for permission to enter. But the house door didn't open, and then the man suddenly said, "We need to show you something." What? The man walked over to an old box in the corner of the attic. It was covered with a thick layer of dust. The man opened it. Inside were various things: old papers, photographs, yellowed letters, and a thick notebook in leather binding. The man carefully took it out. I found this many years ago. He handed the notebook to Artyom, the diary of the house's first owner. Artyom opened it. The pages were yellowed. The ink had faded in places. The handwriting was neat, old-fashioned. He began to read. May 14, 1932 today, we finally moved into the new house. The forest around is beautiful. My wife says it's too quiet here, but I like the silence. Artyom flipped through several pages. June 3 at night, I heard footsteps. Probably the beams. The house is old. Another page. June 17, the footsteps repeat every night. Sometimes it seems like they're walking right above my bed. Artyom slowly turned the page. The pages were becoming more disordered. The handwriting less neat. July 1 today, I found a room I'd never seen before. Photographs on the walls. I don't understand who these people are. Artyom felt his heart begin to beat faster. He continued reading. July 4, my wife says I've gone mad. She doesn't see the room. Says there's just a wall there. But I know it exists. The next page was almost completely filled with writing. July 9 voices. They speak from the walls. They warned. Artyom quickly turned the page. The ink on this page was smeared, as if the person was writing in panic. July 12, the house is alive. Now I understand this. It watches. It waits. It chooses. Artyom looked up at the man. What does chooses mean? The man only said quietly, keep reading. Artyom turned another page. This was the last entry. The handwriting was almost illegible. July 15, if someone finds this diary, don't stay here. The house has already chosen me. It always chooses only one. But the others, they remain outside, watching, waiting, until the house chooses a new one. Artyom slowly closed the diary. Silence filled the attic. Too heavy. So, he whispered, the house chooses one person. The man nodded. Yes, and that person becomes part of it. Artyom felt everything go cold inside. And you? The man looked at him with a long gaze. I think, he said quietly, the house still hasn't decided. Artyom looked out the window again. The figure by the porch had disappeared. But the others, they were no longer standing by the trees. Now they stood around the house, very close, and then Artyom noticed something else. Footprints had appeared on the ground in front of the porch. Fresh ones. They led straight to the door. But they didn't return. Chapter 8, Night Without Time. Artyom stared at the tracks by the porch for a long time. They were clearly imprinted in the wet earth. Footsteps leading up to the door and stopping, as if the person had simply vanished. Did he go inside? Artyom asked quietly. The man from the attic shook his head. No, then where did he go? The man didn't answer. He just closed the curtain on the small window. Better not to look at them too long. Why? Because sometimes, he paused for a second, they start looking back. Artyom felt an unpleasant chill in his chest. He stepped away from the window and looked at the old diary again. The diary says the house chooses one person. The man nodded. Yes, and what happens then? The man was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, I don't know. You've lived here 20 years and you don't know? Because no one comes back. The words hung in the air. Artyom suddenly realized he was very tired. Too much had happened in one day. I need to get out of here, he said. Try, Artyom frowned. You seriously think I'm just going to stay here? He walked to the trapdoor and opened it. The second-floor hallway was empty. The house looked normal again. Quiet, too normal. Artyom went downstairs. The man followed him, but stopped halfway down the stairs. You coming? Artyom asked. The man shook his head. I rarely go downstairs. Why? Because sometimes the house doesn't like it when I walk through the rooms. Artyom said nothing. He walked to the front door. His heart was beating faster. He turned the handle. The door opened. Cold night air hit his face. He stepped onto the porch. The forest around was dark. The figures he'd seen before had disappeared. There was no one between the trees. See, he said, looking back at the man. Everything's fine. He went down the steps, walked to his car, got out his keys, pressed the button. The headlights flashed. It's all over, he muttered. He got behind the wheel. The engine started right away. Artyom exhaled with relief. Thanks for the hospitality, he said, looking at the house, and drove off. The road from the house went through the forest. Narrow, old, but passable enough. The headlights lit the path between the trees. Artyom drove slowly. In 5 minutes, he should reach the main road. But 10 minutes passed, then 15. The forest still didn't end. Artyom frowned. Strange, he drove for several more minutes, and suddenly light appeared ahead. He exhaled with relief. The headlights illuminated a familiar silhouette. Artyom slammed on the brakes. Before him stood the same house, the same fence, the same porch. He looked in the rearview mirror. Behind him was the road, the same road he'd left on. No, he whispered. He turned the car around and drove in the opposite direction. The headlights lit up the forest again. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15, and again light appeared ahead. Artyom felt his heart begin to beat faster. The car slowly drew closer, and again he found himself facing the same house. He got out of the car. The house door opened. The man from the attic stood on the porch. He looked at Artyom without surprise, as if he'd seen this many times before. I told you, he said quietly. Artyom looked at him. What's happening? The man answered calmly. The forest won't let you out. Artyom looked at his watch. 9:47. He froze. He clearly remembered checking the time earlier, when he was sitting in the kitchen, and then it had been 9:47. This is impossible, he whispered. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. 9:47. Not a second more, not a second less. Artyom slowly raised his head. How much time has passed? The man looked at him and said quietly, You've been trying to leave for several hours now. Artyom felt everything inside him constrict. Then why? The man finished for him, because time doesn't move here. At that moment, a clock in the house behind him began to chime. Loudly, slowly, but with each strike, the hands didn't move. Chapter 9, the last room the clocks in the house kept striking. Slowly, dully, each strike echoed through the walls, but the hands on the clock face didn't move. 9:47. Artyom stood in the doorway and looked at them. Are they broken? He asked quietly. The man shook his head. No, then why isn't time moving? The man answered so calmly as if talking about the weather, because the night isn't over yet. Artyom frowned. What does that mean? It means, the man thought for a second, that until the house finishes what it started, morning won't come. The words hung heavy in the air. Artyom walked into the living room. The clock hung on the wall. Old, wooden. The pendulum swayed, but the hand stood still. 9:47. He turned away sharply. That's impossible. The man silently sat down on a chair. I told you, many things here are impossible. Artyom began pacing around the room. His steps echoed dully in the floor. If time isn't moving, does that mean we're stuck? Possibly. And how does this end? The man was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, usually, it doesn't end. At that moment, the floor under Artyom's feet creaked softly. He stopped. The creak repeated, but now the sound was different. Not the usual creak of old boards. This was a sound like something was slowly moving under the floor. Artyom looked down. Did you hear that? The man nodded. Yes, the creaking grew louder. The floorboards trembled slightly. And then, a crack appeared right in the middle of the room. Artyom stepped back. The floorboards began to separate. Slowly, like someone was opening a door from inside. Dust rose into the air. After a few seconds, a dark rectangular hole appeared in the floor. A hatch. Artyom stared at it, not believing his eyes. There was no basement here. The man said quietly there wasn't. The hatch opened completely. Cold air rose from inside. Very cold. Artyom moved closer and shined his flashlight down. The beam of light fell on a staircase. Wooden, very old. It went deep down, into the darkness. Was this here the whole time? Artyom asked. The man slowly shook his head. No, then where did it come from? The answer came almost in a whisper. The house made it. Artyom stared into the dark opening for a long time. Think there's an exit down there? The man laughed quietly, but there was no joy in his laughter. There are no exits in this house. Artyom gripped the flashlight tighter. Then I'll check for myself. He put his foot on the first step. The staircase creaked softly. The man watched him from above. Has no one gone down before? No, why not? Because this is the last room. Artyom stopped for a second. The The last, yes, what does that mean? The man answered very quietly, I think. That's where the house finishes its work. Cold air rose from below. Artyom took another step, then another. The staircase went deeper and deeper. The flashlight beam barely reached the bottom. After a few minutes, he finally descended. The floor was stone, cold. The room turned out to be bigger than he expected, and completely empty. But when the flashlight beam swept across the walls, Artyom froze, because the walls were mirrored, not ordinary mirrors, enormous ones, from floor to ceiling, and in each mirror the house was reflected, but not the one he was standing in. A different one, the same house, but empty, without furniture, without people, without light, as if it were another world inside the house. Artyom slowly turned, and suddenly realized one horrible thing. The house was reflected in the mirrors. The room was reflected. He was reflected, but in one mirror. His reflection wasn't there. Someone else stood in his place, and that someone was slowly smiling. Chapter 10, The House's Choice. Artyom froze before the mirror, where there was no reflection of him. Instead stood a man he had never seen before. But the eyes were his eyes, the same ones that looked at the world with horror, panic, and confusion. He took a step back. What is this?" he mumbled. The man from the attic quietly descended the stairs. "This is your turn." Artyom felt cold run through his entire body. "My turn, the house chooses," said the man, "and it doesn't choose the one who wants to leave." Artyom surveyed the room. Mirrors were everywhere. Each one reflected the house he was in, and rooms that weren't there, as if the house existed in thousands of layers, and each layer, the life of those who tried to leave. "So," said Artyom, "everyone who was in the forest, they didn't leave," answered the man. "They are part of the house now, and I'll become part of it." Artyom's voice trembled. The man nodded. "Every new master, everyone who stays, becomes its eyes, its hands, its memory." "But why do they choose me? Why me?" "The house doesn't explain," said the man quietly. "It just chooses." Artyom looked at the mirror where his double stood. He raised his hand. The double raised it exactly the same way. And in that moment, Artyom understood. He could no longer leave. His heart beat faster. Cold filled every cell of his body. "I don't want to," said Artyom. The man shook his head. "It's too late." And then Artyom heard the whisper. Quiet at first, then louder, as if all the voices he had heard in the house these past days had gathered at one point. "He chooses, he chooses, he chooses." Artyom felt his feet stick to the floor. The room began to contract. The mirrors reflected his panicked face from all sides, thousands of times. And every time he tried to turn away, another him looked straight at him, smirking. "This is the end," mumbled the man from the attic. Suddenly Artyom heard heavy footsteps from above. The house began to creak, as if breathing. The walls trembled. The attic hatch opened by itself. "He's come," said the man. "The house always comes for the one it's chosen." Artyom felt a cold force envelop his body. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. A flashlight beam flickered on the mirrors, and suddenly he saw his reflection begin to move on its own. The smile on the double's face grew wider. The eyes weren't human, as if the house itself was looking through him. "No," whispered Artyom. "No, he chooses," repeated the voices. Artyom felt his body contract, and in that instant the mirror suddenly swallowed his reflection, and everything froze. Darkness, the creak of floorboards, the whispers fell silent. The clock showed 9:47 again. The man in the attic looked at the empty room. "New master," he said quietly, "it has chosen." And outside the window the forest became still again. But new figures stood between the trees, watching, waiting, and one day they too would hear the whisper, "He chooses." The house was alive. The house chose, and now it had a new face, new eyes, new hands, and the night continued endlessly.